All right. Securing the end-to-end software development lifecycle, right? So this is something that, again, I think when we start talking about application security posture, right, you can't have that conversation without sort of looking sort of end to end, right? I think you have to see this as, there's threat vectors that start at any one of these points along the way, right? I think, looking at things like malicious or bad code as a result of misconfigured or poorly configured, Git repos, right? Compromises in open source. I think, me personally, I think that that's one of the biggest risks to organizations today, and it's something I need to pay close attention to, is sort of the open source code that they're using. And as you walk through this, things like compromised build systems, the ability to go ahead and actually alter an artifact that has left a build system while it's sitting in a repo, right? And then looking at things like, a really dynamic landscape, like what's happening with vulnerabilities, and again, most of those vulnerabilities are centered around open source, right? And that's a very, very dynamic landscape. So you have to make sure, if you do something at build, that's great, and that's something that we encourage, right? Make sure that you're following sort of those shift left guidelines, but it can't stop there, right? You have to continuously be watching to see if anything's changed based on the libraries that were used to build that artifact. And then ultimately your deployment layer, right? So being able to say, let me take a look at what the infrastructure as code is going to do. What are the Terraform scripts going to do to this environment that I'm about to deploy into? What does the Helm chart look like? How am I deploying, right? And sort of what does that setup and configuration look like, to make sure that I'm not getting off on the wrong foot, right? And make sure that I'm as I make those changes, before I hand off primary responsibilities to sort of a cloud security posture management tool, that I've at least seen this all the way through to sort of a production deployment. So we look at that as one big attack surface. And I think, being able to make sure that you're using your SDLC and understanding how to secure it sort of as you go, right? So the way we see it is, again, source code security, and you'll notice this in our product as well: source code security, build security, artifact security, and deployment security. And that's sort of how this maps to, sort of how people think about writing their SDLC, right? Or when they go to construct their SDLC. Again, it goes back to, your SDLC doesn't know the velocity that you're running at. It just knows that you have to enforce certain things. And those enforcements are not only just best practices, but let's say you're a SaaS provider. You need to make sure that you're following the guidelines of ISO 27001, SOC 2 Type 2. You need to make sure that that stuff gets baked in there, and then you need a way to be able to prove it, right? So again, I think this is the way we see this, and ultimately how it maps to, sort of the more generic deployment lifecycle. But again, I think at the end of the day, being able to sort of codify and making sure that you've got the appropriate checks and balances in place, while being able to maintain that level of velocity that you're deploying at. Oh, by the way, this is also another one of those really important things here. You can't put any more burden on the developers, right? This needs to be transparent to them. They've got their shift left. They've got the guidelines. They understand that security is everyone's job, but it starts with sort of the people that are assembling the code. However, to be able to make sure that you're doing this end to end, we need to make sure that we stay sort of within those guidelines of not putting any more burden upon those guys. Now, some of the details here, and what I did is I went through and just picked out what some of the jobs to be done are, right? So when you think about source code security, obviously first party code security, anything that's being written by your engineers, we need to make sure it's free of code smells and conforms to security best practices. Are your Git repositories configured and secured? I have to tell you guys, for as long as I've been doing this, most of the time, what'll end up happening is these repositories were set up long before the people that are there managing them now had anything to do with it. And and even when you go down the path of saying, hey, I'm going to turn on some of the advanced security features within, say, like GitHub or GitLab, right? They still have to be set up and configured, right? You still have to be able to do those checks and make sure that those things are configured correctly. And so it starts here, right? It starts with source code controls, source code security, sort of how source code is being managed, and having a tool that is going to complement the features that you have available to you at the source code control point. That's hypercritical, and then ultimately is able to report it to you, because also these are other things that, it's not static, guys, right? Like, GitHub repos are popping up all the time within an organization as a new project gets started, or depending on, sort of how you've structured your source code. You don't see a lot of mono repos out there anymore. It's mainly, sort of individual repositories that are owned by different application teams. So again, something that you need to sort of be wary of and make sure you understand. Build security, another big piece here, right? So again, and by the way, guys, these are just some examples of some of the jobs. And this is far from a comprehensive list, but things like approved users triggering the build, right? Who's triggering the build, right? How is that being triggered, right? Make sure you trace that back and understand that. Webhooks comply with SSL and TLS policy, or webhooks are protected by authentication. Again, seems like a small thing. Also seems like a shortcut one could take if you were sort of trying to put something together in a hurry. Build signature generation and capture, right? So, again, this is another one of those things where, from the build system to the artifact repository through to the deployment, we want to make sure we have consistency across that build signature or whatever else you happen to be using. Whether it's as simple as a checksum, you want to make sure that that's being captured and that's being checked at each spot along the way to make sure that that image or whatever that artifact is hasn't been tampered with outside of your normal process. Artifact security. And again, I think, things like artifact vulnerability checks. I talked to a lot of people about this, and again, at build time, and at code check-in time, when you look at things like, what are the vulnerability states, those are very, very point in time things, right? And I think, when you start thinking about what this needs to look like because of the dynamic landscape of the vulnerabilities that are being uncovered or being introduced, you really need to make sure that you've got, sort of artifact vulnerability checking happening. I would even go as far as to say, you want to make sure that you have continuous image checking or continuous artifact checking, so that I can, check it as it moves over to the repo. I could check it again at deployment time, and then I can continue to scan it, over the course of time, while it's in production, so that I can understand sort of net new things that are popping up. And again, extremely important there to make sure you keep a tight handle on those things. Approved build system checks, is the artifact coming from an approved build system? Again, that's another just no-brainer, right? You want to make sure that there isn't some way, again, that things are being injected into your process without your knowledge, right? Or if it just looks like it's coming from a Jenkins server, well, Jenkins servers are one of the most prolific things out there. So you want to make sure it's coming from, sort of a build system that is approved. And then deployment security. Again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but as every deployment has the possibility of being needing to make changes to sort of that deployment infrastructure. And so looking at things or interrogating things like Terraform scripts, Helm charts, and other sort of pieces to make sure that things are being deployed according to best practice guidelines, right? So that immutable infrastructure that's going to be stood up, you want to make sure that that's meeting those guidelines. And again, I mentioned artifact efficacy here. Again, you want to make sure that the artifact that's being leveraged is the same artifact that left the build system and landed in the repo, and now is going from the repo out to and being used to create the necessary application structure for your application being deployed. And again, I think this is all, you know, sort of hypercritical. And again, if you guys notice too, I got some subliminal messaging going on there. I got some open source tooling that you can use for each of these steps along the way, right? You know, so you know, as you go through this and think about sort of, you know, sort of how I can go about doing this or how do I get started, these are just some of the tools that you know you can use in order to make that happen, and make sure that these things are running the way they're supposed to.